the main thing I would say is don't be shy. If you encounter someone who you think could help you, ask them to help you. Take the initiative, because that's going to be critical in the career. And be very aware too of the fact that there are support networks out there.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Student Lawyer podcast series. Whether you're at school, sixth form, university, thinking about a career in law, or exploring law careers, you're in the right place. We are the one-stop shop for student lawyers. If you'd like to join the Student Lawyer as a writer, please email hello@thestudentlawyer.com. This episode is sponsored by the University of Law. The University of Law offers a range of undergraduate and postgraduate courses and master's degrees alongside an award-winning pro bono clinic, so you can build up your legal experience while studying. And their experienced career service will enable you to put your best foot forward when launching your legal career. The courses are employment focused and based on real legal practice, so you'll be better prepared for the workplace. Part-time and online study options are available so you can work and study at the same time. Click the link in the description box of the podcast to find out more about the courses on offer. Welcome to the Student Lawyer podcast. My name's Camilla and I'm a law graduate currently applying for training contracts. Today I'm joined by Daniel Black, Commercial and Insolvency and Civil and Employment Law Barrister at Hare Court. Daniel is going to be talking us through his journey to the bar and providing some tips along the way, so do make sure you stick around for those. So welcome to the Student Lawyer podcast, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's get straight into the questions. I know that when we were discussing setting up this podcast, you mentioned a little bit about your background, and you said that you went to a state school and the idea of becoming a barrister wasn't necessarily commonplace. So I thought we'd just kind of kick off the episode by just finding out a bit more about, when you did decide to become a barrister, how that sort of came about and why.
Of course. Well, I suppose the idea when I was at school becoming a barrister was a distant prospect for two reasons. First is that I was in Scotland.
Right.
And second relates to, I suppose, perhaps some of the more structural issues which your listeners will be interested in. But it ties actually pretty similarly, because at the sort of school I attended, there wasn't the structures in place really to guide you to say if you wanted to become an advocate in Scotland, which is the equivalent position as you got older. I mean, that's absolutely no slight on the individual teachers, some of whom were absolutely marvellous and made great and incalculable contributions to my path going forward. And it's again also not to say that people from my school hadn't gone on to go into law. Certainly that had happened. But one of the difficulties it seems to me from certain types of state schools, not all, is that there's not a great culture of networking back. And the lack of a culture of networking back and providing support networks and information networks to people who are perhaps looking or even just thinking about going down certain paths is a difficulty. In terms of when I decided that I wanted to study law, then to take it at that stage, the simple answer actually is when I finished my hires, that's the equivalent of A levels, I wanted to do something impressive. Now, I guess I was perhaps more arrogant at 17 than I'm proud to think back on now, but law seemed to me to be impressive in that extent.
Yeah. And
I went and did it. Now, very quickly, when I did start it, more serious thoughts were coming. I enjoyed the processes. But in terms of the decision to become a barrister, I'd just come back, and I realised we'll come to this later. I'd just come back from studying in the United States, and my dissertation supervisor, an English constitutional law professor, Adam Tompkins, he asked me, did I want to go to the bar? And to tell you the truth, my initial reaction was yes, because I thought that was the answer he wanted to hear, and I wanted to continue building my relationship with him. But
right.
Following that answer, he talked to me about the process and what it would involve, and pointed me in the direction of scholarships. And it was at that time that I gave it serious reflection, and I reflected back actually on what had been going on during law school in the United States and during my legal education initially at the University of Glasgow. And I realised that it was the process of taking the materials in front of me, analysing them, and then constructing and formulating arguments as well as they could be put on the materials before me. That was the intellectual process, rather, which I most enjoyed. And really it was for that reason that I decided to become a barrister, because I thought, the intellectual processes that are going to be involved day to day, even on the more mundane matters, that was what fired my intellectual passions, as it were. So that's a sort of elongated answer. The reason I make it elongated, of course, is that there's no correct trigger for why you want to become a barrister. Ultimately, there can be a number of wrong triggers. You can decide various things for the wrong reasons, but there isn't a correct one there. If you reflect properly on it, and you decide that, taking into account the challenges that come with it, that it would be for you. So I wouldn't want your listeners to think that there are sort of preset paths in terms of your motivation.
No, I guess that, people might enjoy their job for different reasons, I suppose. So everyone's path is likely to be different. But I think it was really interesting how you kind of had that professor who was a bit of a mentor to sort of guide you towards the right path. And I think that kind of highlights the importance of, like you said, networking and maybe seeking out mentors. So I thought that was really interesting.
I'm really glad you said that, actually, because I think, and this comes in later in the process too, and I realise it's not always easy to achieve it. But if you can find a mentor, if you can find people who can steer you, that really is invaluable, and it certainly was for me.
Brilliant. So let's move backwards a little bit to your school and university years. So what do you think the biggest challenges were as a state school student pursuing a career in law? I mean, do you think there were any? Did you sort of notice any differences between your journeys and perhaps someone else's that maybe went to private schools or had a more sort of traditional route to the bar?
Personally speaking, the biggest challenge was a sort of a fog of lack of knowledge, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
Because you can find out certain parts about the process and certain parts about what are required, but it is really useful to be able to have informal chats with people in the know, and certainly from certain types of state schools, it's not natural to have necessarily those networks. Now, ultimately, people who go to the bar and who succeed at the bar, whatever their background, are going to have to overcome significant challenges, and it unfortunately may just be more difficult for some people at the initial stages. So, for example, I had to try and build my own network's a very formal term, but build relationships with people who I could speak to and ask about it. You've already alluded to Professor Tompkins, who gave me my first real insight into it. So I suppose the main thing I would say is don't be shy. If you encounter someone who you think could help you, ask them to help you.
Yeah.
Take the initiative, because that's going to be critical in the career. And be very aware too of the fact that there are support networks out there as well, and there are opportunities to speak to people who volunteer to give their time to help people through the process. And it is, of course, these are not easy things to do, to approach people and to approach organisations. I appreciate that they can be daunting, and I appreciate as well, because I suffered from this at the time, that perhaps you want to put your head down and just try and blast your way into off your own steam. But ultimately, there's everything to be gained from the knowledge of others and the vicarious experience of others. And if you do have to make some of your own opportunities early on in terms of those initial relationships, then that's only going to stand you in good stead. So I hope that answers what you were getting at there.
I completely agree. And I think that with LinkedIn now, it has become a little bit easier potentially than it might have been a few years ago. I think it is, easier to find people that have had maybe similar backgrounds to you, who've made it in the profession, seek people out perhaps from the same university that you went to or the same, school or whatever. So you can actually have that to relate to them and then actually kind of work on whatever you need to do to be able to succeed in the profession. So I think that's
definitely, and most people are very nice, and if they don't have time, they'll apologise and say they don't have time. But yeah, I think you raise a very, very good point there.
Brilliant. So I know how important academics are at the bar and, in law careers in general. And I noticed from your LinkedIn that you have a first-class degree. So I was wondering if you'd be able to share your tips for students who want to secure as high grade as possible, hopefully a first, and what your tips are for that.
Yes, absolutely. So you've made me a bit bashful raising these things, but perhaps if I can try and marry my experience from studying with my experience from teaching, which I did, and lecturing, which I did after.
Yeah.
The core thing, if you're aiming for a first, it seems to me, is that you have to be prepared for a very long and hard slog.
Right.
And it is that simple. It can't be sugar-coated.
Okay.
There may be some exceptions to that rule. I wasn't one of them.
So you're not going to tell us of any shortcuts then?
No, but what I can tell you how to do is to diamond stud your work, as it were.
Okay.
So most law degrees are assessed by a combination of essays and problem questions.
Yes.
Now, the approaches to them are distinct, but they hang on, assuming you can grasp the knowledge requirements, they hang on structure. The difference between a really good answer and a very good answer regularly is structure. So, for example, if we were to take essay questions, you want to tell right at the start. It's not an adventure book.
Right.
We're not trying to wade through the woods and see if we find the monster at the end. You want to say right at the start, look, this is my position. Even if that's an equivocal position, you want to just say to the reader, bang, this is where this is going.
Okay.
And then you want to set out the avenues of inquiry which follow.
Okay.
And that, it's that old chestnut in a sense of tell them what you're going to tell them it, and then tell them what you've told them. It is very simple, and you give that structure. So many great or potentially great essays don't quite reach that threshold,
right?
Because they become a bit murky. The way I used to think about it is you want to hold the marker's hand. You want to hold the marker's hand as you progress through the essay. In terms of problem questions, I always remember she's a professor now, I believe, Professor Janine Carruthers, who taught me obligations when I was at the University of Glasgow, an absolutely marvellous lawyer. And she used to hammer into us the phrase, the IEA, the IAE mantra, which is for every issue you identify in a problem question, you want a distinct paragraph, and the I is issue. You want to identify what this precise legal issue is. The A is the analysis. You want to analyze it. And then the E is your explanation. You want to explain that back to the question which is asked.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you're again holding hands, but you're just doing it in a different structure. You're saying to the marker, it's point one, the law which applies to point one is this, and this helps us answer the question because.
Definitely. That sounds like a really good structure, because I've heard of, I think they call it IRAC, IRAC. I think that's possibly what I used back in the day. But I think I would definitely echo that. Having a structure is really important.
Yeah. Now, what I would add to that as well is you've got your structure and you've got your knowledge. Now, let's assume you've got your knowledge on the threshold of 2-1 first, which a large number of candidates get to.
Yeah.
What can you do to kick yourself over the line? And this is a good skill, by the way, for people once they get to the bar as well. You've got to know your audience. You've got to know the forum you're pitching to. And the forum you're pitching to is academics.
Okay.
Now, academics will like you to go away and read academic commentary and lace it through your answer. Now, my personal view is you should enjoy doing that anyway, actually, if you're doing a law degree and you're wanting to go down into the profession, because you should want to get into the knottier issues. But if, for example, you can turn around and you've done, say, the analysis step in a problem question, and you can say, look, but Lindsay says the law ought to be X.
Right.
If you can then take that stage further and critique that, so it's not just dropping in some academic commentary, it's engaging with it. And if you can do that, even if you're saying, this must be right because of X, it doesn't have to be this is wrong because of Y, then that shows the real thoughtful engagement with the problem. And you do similar things in essays as well. So if you can try and bring in academic commentary and engage with it in the wider context of the law which is in play, then that's really the best way to sort of turbocharge yourself and get over the first threshold.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's so helpful. I don't think I've ever heard anyone kind of break down how to answer a problem question and how to kind of score a first like that. So thank you so much. I'm sure our listeners will find it helpful as well. So we mentioned a little earlier that you studied in the US for a year. So I'd love it if you could tell us a bit more about that, because that sounds very exciting.
Absolutely. So I went to North Carolina, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is a very, very good law school in the United States. And I was parachuted in there for my time abroad as part of what they call the JD program. So in the United States, it's not commonly well known here, law is a postgraduate degree. So I went out there during my third year of undergraduate at Glasgow University. There's 4-year undergraduates in Scotland. And I was parachuted into classes with highly driven and extraordinarily clever, actually, Americans.
Really?
Yeah, and you can the drive is astonishing as well, because you think about the amount of fees they paid at undergrad and then they go into law school. So their drive is incredible, and they were obviously quite a bit older than me at that stage. But it was a marvelous crucible of learning, and the exposure to American law was fascinating. I did 3 courses. I did national security law, and military justice, and the jurisprudence of capital punishment, which were the sort of courses that are just not on offer.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it really was. It really was. And they're just not on offer in the UK because of our circumstances, really. It's harder to find courses like that. And I had a marvellous time. That there was a bit of the old Socratic method in some of the classes, which I suppose toughened you up a little.
Right.
And it was very interesting to see an insight into the American approach to studying these matters, how people would consider them, seeing how American judicial reasoning works, because it quite often goes on party political lines, particularly when constitutional matters are in play, and that was fascinating. And I also, and this goes back to what we said right at the start, I mean, I met there the single most important influence on my academic and to some extent professional life, Professor Scott Silliman. He'd been a Judge Advocate General in the US Air Force. That's a military lawyer who is out on deployment. That was during Gulf War I, and he became the head of the Centre of National Security Law at Duke University, or Duke as they call it, which is a big rival to UNC. It's just down the road. But he'd studied at UNC and he came to do classes there. I took 2 of his national security law and military justice. And he was the sort of person, he is the sort of person who couldn't have more time for his students. And my legal reasoning abilities developed under him marvelously, actually. And that's another thing I would point out to those who are listening who are still students, which is, and obviously, look, there will be some who won't do this, but most of your professors and your tutors will be happy to talk about the law a bit.
Yeah.
And you can just learn so much by doing that. And that really has proved invaluable to me. The rest of the United States, well, it was down in the South. It was a fascinating cultural experience. It gave me something to talk about in that respect in interviews. Now I'll come back to additional things perhaps that can be discussed. Yeah, exactly. And I'll come back to some things that can be discussed in interviews towards the end, because I've had a foresight of what you might ask me. So I hope that was to some extent helpful.
Thank you. That sounds so interesting. Such a great experience. So do you think you came back to the UK afterwards, and do you think you were completely different after that experience, like in terms of just the way you thought and maybe the way you approached studying?
It changed my life insofar as to say I had never actually realised how much it rained in Scotland. Seriously, because in North Carolina, the blue skies, they call it Carolina blue skies. It was sunny all the time, unless a tornado came in. But we can forget about that. But it was sunny all the time. And I'd known, obviously, growing up in Scotland, the weather wasn't great there, fine. But I hadn't realised quite how bad it was. And I'd been back a few months, and I was like, I will move somewhere with a better climate. And it might stun your listeners, but to me, London's climate is marvellous. So in that sense, it changed where I wanted to work. It changed where I wanted to be. In terms of how it changed my thinking, yeah, it definitely changed the way I approach legal problems. I was much better at it, and I was capable. I think before I went to North Carolina, to tell you the truth, my thinking when it came to legal problems was a bit too dogmatic. I think I approached them wanting an outcome and reason towards it. And when I was in the United States, that changed. I became much more interested in broader thought and abandoning outcome-driven reasoning in favour of a more deep intellectual inquiry, and that is something I'll be grateful for the rest of my life, actually.
It sounds so interesting. So let's move on to, just got a question about advocacy, really, because that's obviously a very important skill for barristers to have. Is that something that you've always been good at, or is that something that you need to improve? And what are your top tips for people that want to improve their advocacy?
Everybody needs to improve, certainly.
Okay.
At the stage of applying for pupillage and when you're starting out in your practice. I don't think you would find a barrister who'd say otherwise.
Right, yeah, that makes sense.
In terms of whether I was always good at it, I think I was always confident, but that's obviously a very different thing. And you've got to be able to put on a hat of hard-headed realism.
Right.
And you can't be afraid of identifying your own weaknesses and areas for improvement. Now, that's easy to identify as a process. How do you do it? So I'm going to suggest two things here that are really indispensable.
Okay.
Tip one for improving your advocacy,
right,
is dip in and out of Supreme Court hearings. We have now this wonderful resource online where the greatest advocates in England and Wales and from Scotland and Northern Ireland, depending on the case, and indeed, Privy Council jurisdictions are broadcast live as well. So we have advocates from all across the world. But you have a great resource with some of the finest advocates that there are, and just pay attention and note the odd thing down. I'm not saying become an addict and watch it like you would Netflix, but notice their pacing, notice their structure, notice that styles are different, and just gradually pick up traits and methods from the advocates that you see in these broadcasts, and then practice your advocacy. It's good to do mooting. It's good to do some amount of free representation if you can. Other public speaking is very useful too. And then assess what you've done when you go home by reference to what you were aiming for, having looked at some of the best. And if you do that, then that's a great way to improve your advocacy, certainly in terms of how you would speak in an interview and later how you would do submissions. Obviously, cross-examination, that style of advocacy is very different. And that's just something really you have to learn initially on the bar course in terms of the fundamentals. Yeah. And then subsequently when you have in-house advocacy training at chambers and in practice. So know what you're targeting and practice toward what you're targeting, if that sums it up.
Brilliant. I really like that tip about watching the courts online because, again, going back to the use of technology, it's just something that, I mean, I don't know how long it's been broadcast, but obviously you'd need to kind of go to a court to be able to sit in the public area and watch. But now you can literally watch it from your bedroom. So I think that's amazing. I'd like to take a moment to speak about the University of Law, which is the university I decided to study my LPC at. The University of Law is the sponsor of this podcast and makes it possible for us to continue bringing these episodes to you. So we really appreciate you supporting us by supporting our sponsors. What really sets the University of Law apart from other universities is its belief in training students for the real world from the moment they accept a place. The University of Law's experienced career service and award-winning pro bono clinics offer students the chance to get real-life legal experience which can boost employability. They offer a range of undergraduate and postgraduate legal training and master's degrees designed by qualified experts to help students excel at any stage of their career. Their courses are employment-focused, honing key skills in a teaching environment based on real legal practice. Part-time and online study options are also available on many of their courses to help students work and study at the same time. If you'd like to find out more about the courses on offer, please click the link in the description box of the podcast. So I just want to ask you about your journey to the bar now. So what was your journey like to securing pupillage? And was it something that you started straight after university?
Tortuous, occasionally miserable. Not straight after university, no. So I studied initially at the University of Glasgow, where I studied Scots law. I came down and I did parts of the GDL to convert to English law, and then I went to Oxford to do the Bachelor of Civil Law, BCL degree there. And subsequent to that, I went through a few rounds. There were some reserve offer miseries along the way. It's a painful thing to hear. We think you're good enough, but you're just not. You're just not the best, and we'll take you if this person. So close. I know, indeed. But look, I'm delighted how it's all turned out. I've had a wonderfully supportive chambers from day one, and things are going well in my practice. So in terms of the journey, it can be, as I say, torturous, and it can be miserable, but it can also be exciting. And the best tip, and this comes from some experience, would be to say to people, if they are of a nervous disposition, and that's of course only natural, if you can convince yourself before you go into a particular interview that you might as well enjoy it because you may never be back at this level again, then that's a great way to calm yourself, to be like, look, this might be the only shot I get at this. You only get to do it once, potentially, even if you've got other interviews coming up. If you can get yourself into that mindset, then certainly, personally speaking, that was a good way to relax and think, I may as well show the best of myself here, because then there could be no recriminations internally. So, look, the process is difficult, and the process is difficult because barristers are bloody clever, bloody hardworking, and those people who want to be barristers are bloody clever and bloody hardworking. And you can add into that many of them are charming and already very accomplished advocates in other fields. So it's going to be hard. I mean, I think perhaps there's one or two people a year who pick up 10 offers or whatever, and you've just got to doff your cap to them. But for everyone else, it's going to be tricky, even if you've got tremendous qualifications. But if you have self-belief founded on a realistic appraisal of your own abilities, and you have the ability to learn from previous interviews, then you've got a fighting chance, and you can't put it any higher than that. But then you've got a fighting chance.
Excellent. So I noticed that you were in a teaching role before you went to the bar. Kind of, I'd like to know a little bit more about that, if you don't mind, and also what kind of skills you think that provided you with, and whether you think those skills helped you either get to the bar or kind of help you in your career as it is now.
Yes, so I was briefly taken on as visiting lecturer at City, and I was subsequently a lecturer at BPP. That was during the period when I'd secured a pupillage and was filling a year before starting. Now, what skill did it provide me with, or perhaps I certainly would hope amplify? In terms of of assistance at the bar, is you have to get in when you're teaching into the rigid discipline of reducing problems to their simplest dimensions and reducing complex concepts to the most readily understandable way they can be expressed. Now, obviously, I didn't always achieve that. I certainly strive to achieve it. Today, I still don't always achieve that. I strive to achieve it. But ultimately, when you are in front of a judge, you want to be able to strip what's in front of the court down to the essentials and say, look, this is what this is really about. And this is the simplest route to the answer here. And this is right because. And that discipline of being able to strip things down to the simplest dimensions achieved in teaching helps in that, because it sort of programs your mind to think instinctively in a certain way, and I found that useful. I remember, I think that phrase, reducing something to its simplest dimensions, I remember seeing that phrase in an interview from Lord Sumption years ago, and certainly if Lord Sumption is saying that that's valuable, then
definitely,
then it's something everyone should take on board. Yeah, definitely, as you say.
Yeah. Okay, so just some advice really for our listeners who are making applications. Can
I add one more thing? Sorry to cut across you, Camilla. One more thing.
Yeah, of course, go for it.
One other thing teaching helps with is it helps you recognise when people are perhaps having a bad day or finding something tricky, and how to interact with them, the sort of things you would tell them to try and help them. And that allows for some good self-management when you get to the bar as well, because there's going to be some days where a judge just is not taking what you're giving.
Right.
Where the judge is just not persuaded. And you've got to be able, to sort of self-coach yourself, because you're self-employed. You've got to be able to self-coach yourself back to your game, and you've got to be able to do it possibly by the next morning when you've got another trial on. So that's something that was helpful too. Yeah, that's something I put out to your listeners, because it can follow a bad interview. You've got to be able to sort of reorientate yourself and give yourself, the sort of the boosts that are needed perhaps to your morale and belief in order to get up and go again, to put it that way. And I did learn a little bit about that during the time teaching, even though obviously I'm deploying it in a different context when I'm deploying it to myself. So I'm so sorry to cut across you there. It's just that I thought it was perhaps valuable to share.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I think it's really interesting how that kind of helped. To be honest, I was expecting you to say something like, it really helped me with my public speaking. But to hear that, it kind of helped you with those softer skills, dealing with people and explaining things in a way that's kind of easy to understand. I think that's really interesting.
And of course, you're right. It does help with public speaking. It helps with public speaking in the obvious ways, and also in the less obvious ways. That you've got to be able to realise when a judge is turning off, when a judge is getting bored. And I suppose if a lecture hall is getting bored,
similar to students.
Exactly.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so going back to applications and interviews for those who, I don't know exactly when the dates are for application for pupillage, but if someone is writing an application right now and they're kind of listening to this, what advice would you give them for how to stand out in their paper application and then in their interview if they, hopefully make it to that stage?
So this is tricky because different sets look for different things. So there's nothing I can say here which is prescriptive, and I should declare I'm speaking personally and generally here. I'm not speaking about my own set either.
Sure.
Now, by the time you get to the application stage, you've got what you've got. You've got what you've got to work with. So whatever your degree classification is, whatever things on the side that you've done, they're there now. The application, and this is therefore for people who are perhaps writing it without the opportunity to supplement their applications with more relevant experience, and then I'll change context in a moment. Structure, again, is critical. It is absolutely critical. Make your answers as short as possible and as clear as possible and as ordered as possible. You've got to remember that barristers are self-employed. They will be reading these applications in their spare time, and they're doing that because they want to hire the best people to come to their chambers, but you've got to give them a reason to be interested in you. They're going to see lots of people with great firsts and great 2-1. So you've got to give them a reason to be interested in you. And it seems to me that this was just my impression. I haven't read applications, but it was just my impression that if you could make your application easy to read, someone was more likely to look favourably on it. If it was well structured, you were demonstrating, and that you had the important skills that were necessary, or some of the important skills rather, that were necessary to succeed at the bar. Remember how important written advocacy is these days. It's of critical and growing importance, and your application form is a form of written advocacy. Now, remember in that, know your audience and know the question. So if, for example, the question is, why will you be a good barrister? You would be well advised, I think, to introduce questions of that nature by saying there are 3 reasons, 1, 2, 3. By the time it gets to what are your hobbies,
right,
my personal view is it would be foolish to say I primarily do 3 things at the weekends, because you're then you've got a chance to show a bit your personality there. You don't want to stay a robot by the time you get to that stage. So you need to be a bit canny. You need to think about, what is this? What I said, what's this question really about? So some are about your written advocacy, some are about seeing you as a person. Try, and this operates in different ways in the different natures of the questions, but try and fit yourself to the profile of the chambers you're applying to. Ultimately,
that's a great point.
And ultimately, people are going to want to have people they want to work with around them, exactly, and that goes to their intellectual and other interests. So glean what you can. You'd be surprised how many chambers people have given interviews talking about the pupillage processes as well. So I would Google X sets pupillage interview and see if something comes up, and then obviously check the date, check that person's still there, kind of thing, and see if you can glean anything about an individual set there. Recheck sets' own profiles. Square off what's said about sets in the legal directories with the rankings, so you make sure you're focusing on the right things in terms of, if you're talking about their expertise. And also, websites.
Yeah, for sure.
Websites like your own, websites like the Student Lawyer, there are invaluable resources there. Yeah, get set reports, from where you can get them, or get interview tips or application tips from where you can get them. In terms of people who've still got time, it's me changing the context now. People have still got time to diamond stud their application, if I can use that phrase again. You want to obviously get yourself a good degree, and you want to do relevant extracurricular things, but you also want to do something that makes you interested or interesting to talk to, if you get me. If you can supplement your application, which is otherwise strong, with something unique's too strong a word, but interesting.
Yeah.
And perhaps perhaps slightly uncommon, then that's something that you can be asked about and expect to be asked about it at interview, and it's a great opportunity to build a rapport as well. Now, obviously, building a rapport is not going to get you anywhere if you otherwise fall flat in your face and you forget, what consideration is in a contract. But assuming that you're going to get the law right and you're going to deliver it well, then just you want to diamond stud your application with just little points of interest, things that you think other people might be interested in asking about, and that would be my advice. Interview stage, your listeners will be bored to death because I'm going to say structure, and you want to structure your answers. There are little tricks of the trade as well. You can ask for a moment to think before you answer a question. It's often advisable to do so. Don't do it all the time. If you find you've done it a couple of times, then take a drink of water and buy yourself a couple of seconds to think informally that way. But I think if you're answering a problem question in an interview, I would fall back on that structure I said earlier. I would identify what the issues are, analyse them, and then explain how that answers a question. It always seemed to me that when you were preparing a problem question before an interview, you had to be prepared for the very first question when you went into that interview room being, "So, Daniel, what is this question really about?"
Right, okay.
And that ultimately means you need to get right to the core of it and say, amongst this, perhaps morass of issues, this is about whether Mr. X has acted with the utmost good faith at all times. Because if he's not, this whole, insurance setup is going to run into problems. So just identify, if you can frame a problem question answer initially, what your answer is going to be in a sentence or in a couple of sentences right at the start, then that will stand you in good stead. Because a good way to think about large elements of advocacy is, how is this going to be helpful to a judge, or what can I say that is most helpful to a judge? And by being able to frame immediately to an interview panel, this is what this is about, you're indicating that you're the sort of person who can go before a busy district judge who's in a long list of other hearings at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and make that judge's life easier. And if you make that judge's life easier, your chances of persuading that judge are increased. So there's a lot to pack in there. If there's anything else you want me to address in it, then I'm more than happy to.
Sure. I was quite interested in, because you mentioned sort of at the beginning when we were talking about the paper application, showing that you'd be someone that they'd like to work with. And then you kind of mentioned adding in bits that things were a little bit unusual, perhaps. And I assume that's really kind of to show that, like you said, you'd be an interesting person to work with. Do you think that would also translate to the interview? Because from what you've said, it seemed kind of like a technical interview, quite a heavy interview. How would you inject your personality into that, or do you not think you kind of need to at that point?
I think you inject your personality by being as natural as you can, even when you're giving the structured answers.
Yeah.
And remember, of course, you're still in a formal setting when you get on to perhaps more personal questions, but you can loosen your back slightly. If you're answering your personal questions, you're not giving submissions in the way you would be if you're asked your views on a legal matter.
Yeah.
Now, that a large part of that comes down to reading the room, and there will be some interviews where it's just not appropriate, I suspect, to loosen up.
Right.
There'll be others. Generally speaking, first round interviews are more gentle than second rounds. Second rounds, you're often advised to wear a helmet. That's not that's not literal advice. I should stress to the listeners. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you're not good at reading the room, that's not really something that I really can help you with listening to this podcast. That's one of those soft skills you just have to develop through your life experience, But assuming that most people who go forward are canny and can understand these things, then a good dash of common sense always takes you far.
That makes sense. And I suppose you can always have small talk maybe when you're walking to the room to kind of show your personality rather than, and then just kind of answering the questions and reading the room.
Yeah, precisely. And like, brush your teeth, like simple stuff, brush your teeth, dress properly. You don't want to be having, no one's going to want to have small talk with someone, who's just finished a garlic baguette.
Great advice.
This would be the advice, for any interview in any field.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you're totally right. Engage in a little bit of small talk on the way to the interview room. Take the lead of the introducer, if I can use the person who's leading you to the interview room, if I can describe them that way. Take their lead as to whether there's handshakes. Actually, it's probably better before you go in actually to ask the person who's taking you, are there handshakes or not?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to end up leaning across tables. And none of these things, of course, are fatal. But in your own head, you want to be as relaxed as possible. And a wee awkward moment's not going to help you.
Definitely. And actually, I can't remember where I read it. I've been reading or watching YouTube videos and reading books about interviews recently. And I think someone said that if you're if you're carrying a bag, like don't carry a bag and a coat, because it can make you look unorganized in someone's mind. So I suppose it's just little things like that. Like you said, not fatal, but it all kind of adds up to maybe that overall impression.
Yep. Yeah, look, you're deep into realms of psychology there, in which I'm not qualified to venture. All I would say is remember to be the polished version of yourself.
Yeah, sure.
And that's very different than being a fake version of yourself, as I'm sure everyone's aware.
Right. Okay, so I'm really interested to know, what is the most difficult or most random question that you've ever been asked in a pupillage interview?
How would you open a sweetie shop?
Wow, okay. Where do you start with that?
It was subsequently explained to me that this was a metaphor, which didn't really, and perhaps this is to my discredit, but that didn't really illuminate the question for me very much. No, this was at a tax set, actually, and I'd done some tax law at undergraduate, which I'd done very well in, and I just decided I would pop along to an interview and see what it was like, and I don't think I was suited to a tax law, but it was interesting to go along. But that was the most difficult question, and it was certainly the most unusual question, and it's certainly a question I declare right now I did not deal with well whatsoever. Fortunately, there's not been many questions like that. There's not been many questions like that. The questions tend to be designed either to test your legal knowledge or test your reasoning ability, or to see the kind of person you are. And it may well be that question was also designed in such a way, but it was one that I, at least on that day, didn't have the capabilities to answer satisfactorily. But yeah, I don't worry about horror questions. I realise there's sometimes an impression from students that I've previously taught that the people who didn't go to Oxbridge are at a disadvantage in interviews,
right?
Because people who went to Oxbridge obviously did their entrance interviews with odd and obscure questions.
Yeah.
You have to remember that was at least 3 years ago, probably more than that. And in any event, as you can look through the bar nowadays, there's obviously far more to go in terms of representation, but it is getting much better. And there are, of course, many skills you learn when you're at Oxford and Cambridge. There's many skills I learned when I was at Oxford in the BCL and in tutorials, and they do help you in interviews, the skills and experiences that you learn there. But it doesn't matter where you gain the skills. The point is, if you have the right skills and you can exhibit them and exhibit them well, then you get a fighting chance of getting in somewhere.
Brilliant. I'm sure that will really kind of inspire our listeners. So thank you for that.
Pleasure.
I'd really like to know a bit more about your practice and the kind of cases that you deal with on a daily basis. So I don't know if you'd like to share that with us.
Of course, yeah, more than happy to. Obviously, things are slightly different just now, given that we're recording this in the, I'm not sure, we can't call it lockdown anymore, but the sort of semi-lockdown phase of the novel coronavirus pandemic. Now, my practice primarily would be made of 4 features. So I do international travel. I do commercial. I've been doing employment for a few months now. It's something I had a bit of an academic background in too. And then that's all work under my own steam, generally speaking. And then there's work that you would do as a junior for a more senior barrister, or a more senior junior barrister rather, or for a SIL. Now, and this is something to think about. I'll try and structure this as most helpful as I can for your listeners. Those areas have very different day-to-day experiences. So if I'm doing international travel style things, for example, say a gastric illness case abroad, then you're going to be in, or a different type of personal injury case, then you're going to be in fast-track trials quite regularly, and also small claims track trials quite regularly, which keep coming, and you can often find yourself in court 3, 4, 5 times a week. There's other aspects to that as well. I've done a considerable amount of flight delay compensation claims and defending the airlines in those cases, which has been a great way to build up court experience and judge handling experience. And that's been useful. Employment, primarily when I've been doing that, I've focused on disability related matters. And in commercial, generally speaking, the commercial matters I've been involved in, I've turned on contractual interpretation, but I've recently been involved in a fascinating misrepresentation matter concerning private equity. And that really sort of broadened my mind to a whole different sector of the world, really, and how that works in business terms. So in terms of broadening this out for your listeners, different types of sets are going to get you very different lives. So if you go to a chancery set, generally speaking, you're going to spend a lot of time in your chambers, and you're going to spend a lot of time really getting into nitty gritty black letter law. Yes. Now, some people will love that and some won't. Don't just look at a huge pupillage award and plough on for that if that's the lifestyle you're going to hate. Other practice areas will get you in court regularly, which is fun, and there are great upsides too. But by the same token, if you don't want to get on a train to Manchester at 6:05 from Euston quite regularly, perhaps it's not the lifestyle for you. Employment law, obviously, generally speaking, you're going to be in tribunals. You're not going to be in courts, at least at the start, and that raises different issues, and the sort of matters that arise are different. I mean, I've always found really that in employment law, for example, I love the stories, and you're trying to work out the truth in the narrative, but rather the tribunal is trying to work out the truth in the narrative. Other matters, such as, for example, a gastric illness a trial on the fast track, are more self-contained. Was this person served a piece of food which was contaminated? And if it was, say, a road traffic accident, whom was hit by whom? And then just to touch on the other area, if you're going to do more commercially minded matters, then there's going to be a higher incidence of generally speaking, reading documents, but not always, because sometimes the critical evidence is discussions. For example, what representations were made, if any, what were the content of them, and that can be a long way in the future from when you're first looking at the papers, and involves serious amounts of consideration. Now, there are, again, I direct people again to the online resources available, in particular those at the student lawyer, and just have a look at what the different practice areas involve in terms of your lifestyle, and think about that before you go and join a set of chambers, because there may be sets of chambers that you like the idea of them, and more than you would like the the reality of them. Obviously, I hope no one ends up in that position. Although at that stage they will be a barrister, so there will be consolation in that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And what always amazes me really is the breadth of types of cases that barristers deal with, because I think before I started doing this podcast, I maybe had a bit of a naive view that I thought barristers would be kind of more work on one sort of type of case. But speaking to other people and you today, it's just amazing how you just deal with such a broad range of cases. And I think it really must be the case that you just kind of always, I can imagine that no 2 days are the same for you, and I think that's really interesting.
Definitely, yeah. Now some days are similar,
right?
But yeah, no 2 days are the same. No two cases are the same, and sometimes you can be surprised. You think you've got something easy coming ahead, and it turns out, in fact, to be much more complicated than you think. But yeah, you're quite right in what you say there.
Brilliant. Are there any really wacky or memorable cases that you can maybe share with us?
No. You have to remember I'm still a baby barrister. I'm still in my nappies, so I've not really been exposed to that so much. But these stories are obviously out there.
Yeah.
And I think, generally speaking, people go into the criminal law get these stories more quickly.
Right.
A friend of mine who's been a criminal barrister for a year or so, he could regale you over dinner with quite a few tales. So my apologies that I don't actually have anything exciting yet.
We'll invite you back in a few years, and you can find something wacky to work on that you can do.
Splendid.
So what's the best part of being a barrister?
I enjoy the control over my own working hours. I don't want to say freedom, because obviously, whilst it is freedom to some extent, you've got to comply with deadlines and court orders and important matters like that. But you can do the work where you want, say for when you're required to be at court, where you want, when you want, and you can structure your working life that way. And I think a lot of people who are inclined towards the bar have perhaps kept variable or in some cases unconventional studying hours whilst they were students, and it is one of the few professions that allows you to conduct your business that way. Obviously, there are other professions which allow you to conduct your business that way, and if you didn't like what you were doing, then the freedom to do a job you were miserable in, there wouldn't be much consolation. So I do enjoy that, but it pairs to it marries with rather advocacy. I like presenting people's stories or companies' stories and explaining why their version of events is the one that should be preferred by the court. So I think control over style, or control over timings rather, and the skills that are required to be manifest. And that goes all the way back. You may remember, I realise it was a long time ago, you may remember I gave an initially facetious answer as to why I decided to go into the law.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was only shortly afterwards, some time afterwards, where I thought to myself about, no, I'm really enjoying the processes here. And I'm very glad to say that those thoughts of a sort of 18-year-old Daniel Black sitting in the law library at Glasgow University, in terms of enjoying the process, those apply to practice sitting in chambers in Hare Court in the Temple.
That's really nice. And I don't think there's a career quite like it, is there? It's just, it seems like a really rewarding career.
Well, I don't think so, and certainly when I speak to more senior barristers, that tends to be the common consent, that it is deeply rewarding, deeply hard work, but deeply rewarding, and it's a privilege to be involved in it.
Definitely. So you've given us so much really helpful advice and stories today, so thank you very much. But I'd just like to ask if you've got any last words of advice you've got for listeners who are seeking a career at the bar.
Yes. So I've been going on about structure, so I'll give you 3 points.
Great.
So the first is conduct a hard-headed, realistic analysis of your chances.
Right. And how can someone do that?
This is, I suppose, a potentially downbeat bit of the advice. I promise it gets more positive.
Yeah.
Have a look at the sort of chambers you would like to work at, and have a look at the people they've hired in the past 5 years.
Yeah.
And ask yourself, do I really have a chance of getting in here?
Yeah.
And be serious about asking yourself that question. Not, if I really want to do a handstand enough, I'll do one. Really seriously think to yourself, like, here's what they've got. Line it up on the left-hand side of the page and line up on the right-hand side of the page. Go back to their education, their prizes, their scholarships, other things that I mentioned about.
Yeah.
And ask yourself, realistically, have I got a shot at this? Have I got the phrase I used earlier was fighting chance. Ask yourself, have I got a fighting chance? And I use fighting chance very deliberately because when I lined my credentials up with the people at Hare Court, they were considerably better than me, but I thought perhaps with a fair wind, I would have a fighting chance, and unfortunately I did in the end. But take a really hard-headed assessment of that, because you don't want to plough in years of your life and potentially thousands of pounds of your own or someone close to you's money on a pipe dream. It's okay to go down the process not knowing if you'll come out of it successfully. Everyone enters like that, and unfortunately some people don't make it. Some qualified people don't make it for whatever reason. But make sure that you've had a realistic assessment of whether you can get in, and that's the first thing you have to do. And it would be unhelpful of me not to make that clear just now. And I said this to students of mine when they asked this question in the past. The second point is a more positive one.
Okay. Once
you have made that assessment, and once you have concluded that you have a fighting chance of getting into the sort of place you would like to go, you have got to believe in yourself. You absolutely, somewhere deep within yourself, you have to find, even if it's just a kernel of belief which can grow, you've just got to find something within yourself that says that this is right for me. I am going to do this. I am going to achieve this. And you've got to believe every time that you go into an interview room that you're going to be the winner, that you've got the capabilities to succeed, and that you can adjust to the difficulties that may arise even within interviews. Because ultimately, belief isn't going to take you over the line, but it can most certainly stop you getting over the line. And therefore that's critical. The third point, I'm going to split into two. So I'm going to split the third point into two. I'm going to split it into a point of general application and then a point for people who perhaps have interviews coming up and don't have time to do anything different.
Okay.
If you still have time to boost your CV, diamond stud it. Get anything additional on there that might just make the difference between getting through a paper sift and not. That doesn't need to be legally related. For some people, it will need. For some people, it would be preferable if it was legally related, because perhaps they've got great academics and they've got those interesting things on their CV, but there's not a huge amount of legal experience. So perhaps a panel might think maybe they're not, so committed to this. But it can also be something interesting. Now, I don't want people listening to this to think that means you have to go and volunteer in Kenya for 6 months. That's not what I'm talking about. And obviously, for some people, their circumstances will never allow that. We talked earlier about some of the difficulties different types of people face.
Yeah.
But there are all manner of different avenues by which you can evidence interesting things that have involved some of the critical skills towards being a barrister. And the second part of this, which applies to those people who may have interviews coming up, whenever they listen to this, it may be that they listen to this sometime in the future, and don't have time to boost the application. Treat your application form like a skeleton argument. Know that application form inside out, because it's impressive to a panel if you can say, as I said, question 8 of my application, and you'll see I outlined 3 things there. I'm going to focus on the second one. And that just shows so much awareness of what is helpful to a listening tribunal, and also, critically, gives you the chance to sort of make them mark stuff down on your paper. And I would recommend that. And ultimately, those are the 2 things that I would say in bifurcating the third point.
Thank you. That's such great advice. Definitely some things that I haven't really heard of. I really like the point about referring back to your application. I think that would really impress the panel. It would definitely impress me. Anyway, yeah, and also love the structure that you used as well. It's just amazing to see how those little tricks can just make such a huge difference. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on to the show today and sharing all your advice with us and your story. It's been such an interesting episode. And yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for spending your time talking to us. It's
absolutely my pleasure. I realise that it's mysterious in some ways for many people, profession still, that there still is a fog around it and access to it. And if in some small way I've been able to help anyone in terms of thinking about it more clearly and approaches to getting into it, then that's something I'd be humbled by. And I direct them again back to the student lawyers. It's a great resource.
Thank you.
You'd be well advised to spend time there.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for listening as well. Until next time, goodbye. To hear more of the Student Lawyers podcast, hit the subscribe button and leave us a star rating and review. If you would like to join the Student Lawyer as a writer, please email hello@thestudentlawyer.com.